wonderful that you all gathered. We're so happy to have you here to witness John's amazing slideshow on the Baxter canning empire, basically. And we're just, with great gratitude to John for delving so deeply into the Hartley Baxter line, the HC Baxter and Brother pioneering efforts and success in the canning industry in the world. So he's going to give us that perspective and that information, and he's added the Comee family and our ancestry and some to serve all of us here gathered tonight. And John is a historian, architect. He's refurbished homes in Salem, Massachusetts, history in Salem, Massachusetts. I mean, his biography goes on forever. It would be great to have a biography that we could include with it because of the depth and breadth of his experience in historical preservation and the amazing depths and breadth that he's gone to with this research is heartening and informative and deep and broad. So what we would like to do is we would like to offer to you in thanks, we will gift you a framed copy
Beautiful.
of Edgar A. Comee's Flying Corn, Baxter's Finest Flying Can of Corn. And we will print it up nicely and frame it for him.
Sweet.
We thought this would be the gift that would go down in your annals
Very appropriate.
of appreciation.
Absolutely.
Much better than a dinner at the
That's
lobster
right.
house, right?
Exactly.
So we've all signed an HC Baxter Brother
Nice.
stationery
Wow.
thing.
That's
And
wonderful.
it says, for John, with love and gratitude for your kind attention and in-depth research into the Baxter family canning heritage and the Comee connection. And many of us have signed it, and anyone who's here who hasn't signed it, we would like that. Hank, in particular, is,
Gail and Debbie get it?
Yes.
Yeah, they did.
yeah, so it's really just Hank.
Wow.
So if you could do that before you leave, it would be wonderful. So,
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
John.
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are indebted to you.
Wow.
Hartley Baxter is saying, yay, John, because this whole Baxter canning thing just went into oblivion, basically. And he has resurrected it due to his interest in tin cans.
There you go.
Oh,
That's
no.
part of it. That's right. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
all right, yes.
And Connie's being actually too modest because actually she's the one who really got this thing going. Can you all see or hear me okay? I'm sort of hiding in the little corner here because we have to do that for the filming. Anyway, about 40 years ago when I was a much younger man, one of my first jobs out of college was to go back to Brunswick and take a job with Pejepscot Historical Society and oversee a survey of all the historic buildings in Brunswick, of which there were about 600 that I remember. And we title searched all those records and pulled together a lot of research with volunteers, going through old newspapers and old maps and everything. And as this process was going on, I would repeatedly hear about the Baxter canning legacy. And there was discussion about, you know, the First National Bank in Brunswick being the bank with the corn cob capitals. But I never really found much in writing about it. And then, so all these years later, when I'm finally retired from preservation, and we still have a house on Orr's Island, and I'll be up here now full summers, I thought it would be a fun winter project to start digging into this, and maybe I could give a slideshow at Pejepscot, you know, this summer. So it did. As you can see from this first slide, the Pejepscot History Center, which is the new name for Pejepscot Historical, did present the pioneer canners, how the Baxter Canning Companies made a Maine brand. About a month ago, a month and 10 days, on June 9th, we gave this talk for the first time. We had a packed house at the Schofield Whittier House, about 30 people, and it went for 45 minutes. So we know for a fact that this first part of the slideshow can go for 45 minutes without, if we don't get interruptions. But I do need to thank Connie and Liz and Debbie and Scott and a bunch of others who, Connie opened up her whole family to me by email over the winter, and we've been having discussions by email all through the winter months, and people have been sharing old photos with me. So a lot of what I'm going to show here comes from you and this family. I didn't have these images before, and so you may know them better than I know them, but I've certainly enjoyed seeing them. So anyway, to start, we know they were a canning company This first picture, I don't know where it was taken. Pejepscot came up with this one, but it's clearly an assembly line and it looks like they're peeling potatoes. And what Rupert Baxter White of Brunswick told us is that they went into the canning potatoes business after they did things like canned corn because they were looking for ways to create new industry to keep these factories going for more than just a few months a year. In the food canning business, a lot of these factories were moved close to the fields. Here's one of Hartley's patented drawings for a can filling machine that he invented. And so this was shown at the Pejepscot History Center at the Schofield Whittier House. And I was known to them before, as I've said, because I did the survey of Brunswick, and I also wrote a book about Brunswick's first architect, Sam Dunning. And I sort of think of this initiative now. I love logos, and I love, that's sort of, you know. So I was thinking ABCDE is kind of a fun thing you can remember. So this is the Baxter Canning Down East Exploratorium, is what I kind of cooked up as we could call this initiative. Here's Connie with her can of Baxter's golden sweet corn. Now that can is actually here in this room as I speak, the historic can itself, as is Connie. And so this was delightful. Anyway, Connie is best known for her photography, and of course the Baxters are known around the state a lot for the Baxter State Park and preservation of Mount Katahdin. So Connie has done wonderful things with photography of Katahdin, and in fact there is an exhibit going on as we speak at the Curtis Memorial Library in Brunswick of some of the beautiful photographs that Connie took. Ansel Adams quality pictures are just spectacular. And Connie also has another program you should ask her for if you haven't seen this already, called Inspiration Katahdin, which outlines a number of other activities she's got going over this summer. And Connie also, as a photographer, did a video of Rupert Baxter White in his house on McKean Street last Halloween or Thanksgiving in the fall. And I took a still picture from that, and that's how I got this portrait of Rupert. But Rupert's been very, very helpful, and he has been, in effect, not only the sort of senior historian of the family, but he's the one who preserved all these original Baxter canning labels, many of which you see on the table behind you. So this man has done amazing things in the preservation field. Anyway, so he descended, though, he's a grandson of Rupert Baxter, and this is Rupert and his wife over here on the right, and in the middle is Mary, who became our Rupert Baxter White's mother. So yeah, here's the gravestone. These are newer slides I put in recently because I wanted to just recognize Rupert's line a little better. So this is the grave for Rupert Henry Baxter and his wife Kate Mussenden, and those are Rupert. That's Rupert Baxter White's grandparents. And I found this recently too, that the Mussendens were connected with that same First National Bank that's involved with the Corn Cob Capitals. But anyway, I put the word lots in here because the name of this talk was originally talking about how the Baxters invented a brand, a brand of canning. And I found out through the research that we did over the winter, it wasn't just one brand. It's lots of brands. They invented dozens of brands, and they invented many companies to produce and market those brands. So we found it's much more complicated than you would have thought. There are over 40 early Baxter vegetable brands from Brunswick between 1888 and 1906 included. You could have gotten Baxter's Finest, but also Maine's Finest, Canoe Brand, 3B, Puritan, Red Rose. Those were all Baxter products. And to show some of them, this is one of the ones that came from Rupert's collection. This is a new label I saw for the first time in June. And this is just gorgeous graphics. And the 3 B's is a pun on the 3 letter B's, which stand for Baxter Brothers Best. So anyway, that's pretty neat graphics, and that's one of the reasons that these are so wonderful to look at. Just graphically, they're just gorgeous. But as far as the companies go, I throw in the number 6 here because we found out that there are, count them, 6 known companies that were under the Baxter umbrella. So HC Baxter and Company, which Connie mentioned earlier, is the best known of the 6. And that would be Hartley Cone Baxter was his name. And the brother originally referred to just a single brother that helped him, and later on many of his brothers helped him. But about HC Baxter, let's just point out, in 1922 it was noted that HC Baxter and brother are the world's largest packers of corn. The company packs between 3 and 4% of the total U.S. amount of canned corn. It's estimated that they pack daily during the season, the packing season, about 750,000 cans of corn. And in those cans, the better known brands are Baxter's Finest, Snowflake, and Best Reserve, or some of their better known brands. And the distribution of their canned goods is international, which is what Connie also mentioned, as well as national, and their products are shipped to every civilized country on the globe. I don't think marketing today would use that phrase so much. We don't distinguish between civilized and uncivilized countries anymore. But and the home office of this concern is in Brunswick. So that's pretty impressive, gives you a sense of the scope of this thing. And so in addition to the HC Baxter and Bro, we find that, especially for the Wapello, Iowa branch, which Scott's helped us a lot and been out to Wapello, or Wapello, I guess it's pronounced. Is that how it's pronounced?
Wapello.
Well, it is Wapello. Okay, first accent. Okay, Wapello, Iowa, named for an Indian chief out there apparently. But they went by the name of the Baxter Brothers Company out there primarily. So that's a second name. We also find that this is a less well-known one. They used the Augusta Canning Company for a while, even though I don't know if they had factories in Augusta, but they used that as a name. They also used the Hallowell Packing Company with the offices again in Brunswick. So you got a couple of main place names. They used the name Louisa, probably from Louisa May Alcott, Louisa Canning. And they also did the Snowflake. We talked about that briefly already. So we're getting up there in number, and I guess that is probably the 6 right there. And in addition to all those can labels and companies they had going, they also went for a while into the paper box manufacturing business in Brunswick, which had earlier been a very big business in Brunswick, pioneered by the Dennisons. And so they were very involved with a lot of things. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this, Rupert told me, he said of these gorgeous labels that he managed to save, this particular company, the Murison Label Company, which is based in California, produced some of the most spectacular, visually sophisticated labels in the country. And the Baxters are known to have used this company. So they did things like these glorious, romantic West Coast, herald 17th century ship exploration kind of labels for Santa Clara Valley. That was one of the Murison labels. But this whole business about if you've got, a near infinite quantity of canned goods that have a long shelf life, literally, that can, stay preserved for months and months and months, and they are a stable product, and you're marketing through, the state-of-the-art graphics, you really have a global empire at your fingertips. And in the maritime era, they were shipping these things all over the country, and they were responding to, not only just specific demands for food products, but during a war or after a war, canned goods really provided a very basic necessity for soldiers and sailors as well. So, and in Brunswick, I didn't really want to get into this so much because we don't have time, but the Baxters also played a key role in preserving the Harriet Beecher Stowe House on Federal Street, which is now owned by Bowdoin College. And they also, some of you may have just come from Topsom. I'm told there's a Beatrice B. Baxter Memorial Forest in Topsom that's named for the family too. So there's a lot of legacies. And Connie said my interest came about from tin cans, and that's actually kind of true. For a while when I was a teenager, I tried tinsmithing. What I like about tinsmithing and tin is this is a crystal right here of tin in its original state. Tin is was called by the Romans stannum, and that's why you get SN as the atomical abbreviation for the metal tin. But it's also called cassiterite, and that's a cassiterite crystal right there that was found in Maine, up the Androscoggin River a bit in Newry, Maine. So it's a semi-precious metal, and yet it's used for all sorts of things, like in solder, which is used to connect a lot of metals. Tin is basically one of your key metals that's in the ingredient. And in the tin can industry, what you find is it's valued because tin-plated steel is used for making the cans and making a lot of other things. And the plating basically keeps the metal, the iron part, from rusting. So there we go. And if you needed to get back into where this sort of technology and history came from, a lot of it's related to the British Isles, because in Britain you find that there was tin mines in the western part of Cornwall, the Cornish area of England, And by the 18th century, tin plate workers were known to be hammering out wonderful goods out of tin plate. And this was, you may have heard of blacksmiths. Blacksmiths are known for hammering iron. It's the whitesmiths who hammered out the tin. So the tin products were produced pretty much as a poor man's silver and as a much more affordable metal for making things like pitchers and cups and flasks and sconces and candlesticks in the 18th century. And so therefore, you know, they had the container idea early on, and they also made tollware, which is painted tin. But the French came about with this Nicolas Appert about 1809, with science behind food preservation through what's called canning, which basically is cooking foods for a period and then sealing them in a vacuum container. And so the French came up with the technology originally, and they were using glass containers and ceramic containers, which is why the whole tradition of maybe your grandmother or great-grandmother canning preserves in glass bell jars, that's right out of the French tradition. The English took that same tradition and used metal containers. This guy, Brian Donkin, was the first one, the first tin can canner about 1810. And so when the British got into it, they put them in tins, and we get canned tins. So the first tin cans looked like this, not that different from the ones we still have today. And they were made, as I've said, primarily to allow ships to go further distances without crews starving or mutinying, and allows the exploration to happen globally. And the British were very well known for having dispatched a force about 1819 to go look for the fabled Northwest Passage. And they did that going through what's now upper parts of Canada. And what made that trip possible was all the canned goods they had on board. Same thing here in Maine when Macmillan did his polar exploration in the 1920s. They took on a lot of Baxter canned goods on the schooner Bowdoin that allowed all that expedition to take place. And not missing an advertising potential, the Baxter Company went ahead and produced special ads in the 1920s raving about how their products were used aboard Macmillan vessel, which is really cool. So here's Macmillan up north, you know, exploring the far north. But when you get into now the Baxter's involvement with canning and canned goods, what we find is that the generation before Hartley is where it really started, and the father was James Finney Baxter, and he was a junior partner of what was Davis and Baxter, and that also was known as the Portland Packing Company, and they were based in Portland. And then out of that tradition, HC Baxter Brothers emerged. Hartley was the eldest son of James Finney Baxter. And then this shows a neat sort of aluminum token that was produced at one of the factories. This item surfaced, I guess, up near Hartland, Maine, and a husking check would have been used like currency to pay people for husking corn for the factories before they invented husking machines, which came in about 1920 or so. So this would have been the early way they started that first process. And Rupert helped us a lot, Rupert White, with this picture. This is an aerial photograph of the Hartland, Maine plant taken in 1959, he told us. And so you can see there's a lot of buildings here, and they're near a railroad track in the foreground. And so all these factories, the Baxters were able to put them way out in the boonies because that's closer to the farm fields, so the vegetables are fresher when they can them. And then because of that railroad link, you can bring all the food down to Brunswick, you can bring it down to Portland, you can put it in warehouses wherever you want, you can ship it. You know, it's like the railroad made it possible to put these factories all over the country, and they did. So here's a little map that shows where Hartland is in red, and you can see it really is kind of in the heart of Maine, which I think is interesting. It's also just about halfway between Brunswick and Moosehead Lake, which is the blue lake you see on the upper left, and that dark rectangle in the middle of the state is Baxter State Park. So you're halfway between Baxter State Park and here, and halfway up to Moosehead, and that's where Hartland is. It's actually 81.9 miles if you want to drive up there. I have still not been up there, but I would like to go someday. So the Baxters got into this business, and I'm told the family name originally was Baxter, because they were bakers before they were other occupations. I don't know how true that is, but that's rumors circulating on the internet, so it must be true, right? Anyway, but the Baxters, you know, as I've grown up here in Maine, they're primarily known for a couple of things. One, of course, is Baxter State Park, a phenomenal resource. And that's, involves Mount Katahdin and resources in the upper northern part of the state, which are stunning. Over 200,000 acres were preserved by Percival Baxter. And here's his signature. He was governor of Maine in the 1920s. Here's a picture of him as a Bowdoin graduate in the 1890s. Here he is as a later man when he was governor of Maine. This is a picture of him and his dog, I think when he was in Augusta. And his father was James Finney Baxter. This portrait was made for the Public Library in Portland. And you can see in this portrait of him on the far right, there's actually a little bit of his library building visible in the painting. So James Finney Baxter was into a lot of different activities, but the canning was an important one after about 1863. That's when the Baxters got into the canning business. And James Finney, as we've said, was a noted Maine historian, Portland mayor, businessman, philanthropist, and he lived between 1831 and 1921. So I guess he was 80 years old, is that right? 90 years old when he died, wow. And 1831, I mean, we need to do a bicentennial for him in the year 2031. So if you guys want to sign up for that, we have a little sign-up list for fundraising for that. I joke a little bit here, but Baxters are also known around Portland for Baxter Boulevard, of course. And that was also in James Finney Baxter's honor because he was very involved with the planning commissions and process, and all the public parks that were developed in Portland really came about during his mayoral terms. He had like 5 or 6 consecutive terms in the early 20th century. But as a philanthropist, he was known for giving libraries. So the Portland Library originally occupied this beautiful Richardsonian Romanesque Baxter building, which still stands on Congress Street. When I was a kid, this was the Portland Library. And then they, later in the 70s or something, they built a newer building, and this has been reused. If you back out of it, you can see the whole thing is shaped like a basilica. It's a gorgeous building. Olive brown stone is the brown, and then the white is probably a limestone. So you get this checkerboard effect, sort of a Gothic carryover there. So he did the Portland Library. It was gifted to all the citizens of Portland because he valued reading and where books can take you. And then he also gave, for his native Gorham, the Baxter Memorial Library and a Baxter Museum in Gorham, so to help Gorham people as well. So talk about philanthropy, it's pretty amazing. This little cartoon I just drew up back in April because I wanted to just show that really all the Baxter's canneries we've been talking about today, those 6 different companies and all, it all had their beginnings with JPB, with James Finney Baxter. He was the pioneer of the whole thing. And some of their early labels, here's one of theirs, like James Finney Baxter, we haven't gone into hidden that much, but this fresh lobster, Yarmouth Packing Company, if you look on the label, it says Davis Baxter and Company, is behind that. So this is one of James Finney Baxter's products. And they did a lot of canned lobster in their early years, canned seafood. And early on, Portland, Maine emerges as a canning center because of the lobsters and seafood, just the way south of here in Baltimore, Maryland, that area emerges as well because of its proximity to Chesapeake Bay and all the seafoods down there. So those are 2 strong factors behind the emergence of these places as canning centers. So here's another early James Finney Baxter, Davis Baxter and Company label. You can see he's advertising Honey Drop brand Maine corn, and he's got a beehive to show bees and the honey. So that's nice. So this is his, James Finney Baxter had 2 wives. This is his second wife, Mehitable, and Mehitable was the mother of Percival. Here's a little diagram that shows how that worked. So the second marriage for James Finney was to Mehitable Proctor Baxter, and she was descended from the Proctors of Salem and Danvers in the Salem witch trials history of the 17th century. But they had 3 children, whom James Finney affectionately called his second litter. And this is because he had earlier kids by a first marriage, which we'll get into in a minute. But Percival was the middle child of the second litter of kids that James Finney had. And so what happened, because James Finney was so prominent and because Percival was so prominent, in recent years there's been a sort of a distillation and a polarization and a recognition that these 2 figures are the key Baxter figures behind Maine history. And this book came out by Neil Roll, sort of underscoring that. The Baxters are these 2 major figures. Well, what we've been finding out is that the story is more complex than that, and really there's a third sort of element here that needs to be paid attention to, and that's the Brunswick Baxters and all the Baxters that were descended from the first wife. have typically been overlooked, and that's a problem. But here's Percival Baxter on the left at the Baxter House in Bath, Maine, meeting with Rupert Baxter White's mother, Mary, is on the far right, and then his grandfather, Rupert, is in the middle. So they're all the same family. And it's kind of, there's no common sense or logic behind ignoring the amazing Brunswick contributions. And so here's an example of, again, a Brunswick label, the Louisa Canning Company, Red Dragon, beautiful graphics. Oh, the Red Dragon is interesting, I think, because here's another graphic that was used to promote that product. Now, I happen to grow up mostly in the rival high school of Bath, that community over there, where we are known as the shipbuilders because of the Bath Ironworks being our major industry. I've learned, Brunswick High uses as its mascot the dragons. And I would put forth that it possibly is because this dragon corn and the Baxters are so important to Brunswick. I don't know that for a fact, but I find it coincidental and interesting and worthy of more research. So Red Dragon became a dominant Brunswick, and as I said, Brunswick High uses that dragon name now for its sports teams. And here's their logo, the Brunswick High, black and orange, and then the dragon. So if you look at the Brunswick High yearbooks, which I've started to do, up until like the 1950s, all their yearbooks were just called black and orange. And then after the 50s, they were called the dragon. And yet the Baxter canning was still going strong into the 60s. So there was an overlap, and it's quite possible that there's a connection there. But another interesting thing is that the whole Iowa effort, this Wapello, Iowa outreach and development of factories, a factory out there, and why there? Well, it's in the middle of the Corn Belt for one thing, and I'm sure there are other reasons for it too, but the whole impetus for that emerged out of Brunswick. So it was a Brunswick planning process that created the Baxter Canning Company out in Wapello, Iowa. And this is a couple of labels that were used for the Wapello products. I love this one, Firebrand Sugar Corn. And you've got an Indian there making fire. And Wapello was the name of an Indian chief. They also used for Wapello this Big Engine brand sugar corn. Again, very colorful. They like to use red a lot, I think, because when a can's sitting on a shelf, the color red just grabs your eye. So that was probably more of a marketing tool than other things. But they also showed a bushel full of corn that needed to be husked. And this is Hartley. This is James Finney Baxter's eldest son, for whom the Hartley HC Baxter and brother firm was named. He was born in 1857. He attended Bowdoin in Brunswick. He was class of 1878. And then we've got, so in 1876, when he was at college at Bowdoin, it was the American Centennial. The U.S. was celebrating its 100th anniversary. And I think that was the key event that got Hartley psyched about American history and using American history to market some of his early products. What we find is that one of his better known early products called Finest Reserve sugar corn, he uses the fact that corn was originally developed by Native Americans in America to promote his products. So he has a picture of these Indians looking over a cornfield that's being attended to by some Mayflower pilgrims who have stacked up all their guns because they're not thinking about war, they're thinking about agriculture. And this was an early label that Hartley designed when he was still based in Portland. So that would be before 1888, I guess. So typically 1888 is taken as the year that he starts the whole business in Brunswick. But initially he was in Portland, so this is an early design of the label. Here's a slightly later version of the label showing Brunswick as the base. And but best preserved sugar corn. And here's another marketing product for that. These come from Rupert White's collection. They're just stunning graphics. And they also, we know they went down to Plymouth to do research on early American history. And because if you go down to the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth, you'll find that since the 19th century, this amazing painting has been on the wall in that museum. This is done by the British-born artist William Formby Halsall. And what's interesting is, so that's the color original right there. You've got the Mayflower, and it's sending out a little pinnace or whatever, a little, smaller boat for an exploratory party. And then, but the Baxter companies achieve control and use of that label for marketing what they call Puritan brand sugar corn. So here's their label with the same derivative image to it, which is pretty nice. And my guess is they must have paid a royalty to the to the artist or to the Pilgrim Hall or something. But isn't that great? I mean, it's like there's no wonder you've seen this before, because you have seen it before. This image is famous, you know, in New England history. So another name they used to market their products was gems, because they're trying to. The whole business about branding is trying to make a product appear to be very valuable to a consumer, and so valuable the consumer will want to come back and buy more and buy more. So if you give it a name like sterling after sterling silver, or gems after very famous, you know, very valuable diamond rings or whatever, you may have something there. And so you see right here in 1888, HC Baxter of Brunswick filed an application to use the words gem brand on his canned vegetables, fruits, fish, oysters, and meats. So at that early date, he was looking at all those products to be marketed under the gem brand. Now the Baxter's Finest brand ends up being more popular in later years, and here we see the Baxter's Finest brand was being used to market peas, corn, beans, and other foodstuffs. And again, they're just wonderful graphics. And this is a transcription I made from the Heartland Historical Society has come up with a picture they posted on the internet of a rare surviving packing crate that was used by one of the factories up in Heartland, I believe. And it's hard to read. You look at this, the original, it's all beat up and you can barely read it. But if you take the time to figure that out, I think what you get is, it said, Baxter's Finest Fancy Maine Sugar Peas with wine, packed by HC Baxter and Brother Offices, Brunswick, Maine. And the with wine bit, I'm not sure. Rupert thought that may actually have been wine that alcoholic wine, that this would have been for like an export overseas to a European market. That was his take on it. It didn't make any sense to me at all. Why would you put wine, peas in wine? But that could be it. I was wondering if maybe wine was just an industry term for, you know, pea water or something. You know what I'm saying? Just some water that was in with the cans, in with the vegetables. So anyway, but the Baxter's Finest was used for a lot of products. We know also they had baked beans that were canned. Here's another one of their labels for baked beans. And aren't these beautiful? They just, you know, I'm getting hungry just looking at these, you know. And then here's the nice advertising one, very colorful. So peas, beans, corn, and chocolate pudding are all sold here. And then the snowflake I threw in here because yeah. The Snowflake brand also became quite well known, and the way that derived apparently is there was another fellow in Maine called Charles P. Maddox, who was a Civil War hero, kind of like Joshua Chamberlain, and he ended up going to law school and being an attorney in Portland. And then as sort of a side venture, he also got into canning corn as well, and he used the Snowflake label. And then that eventually gets taken over by the Baxters. So that when they purchase that or buy out the rights to use that name, you get labels like this that say Snowflake Lobster, blah, 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 successors to Maddox, you see. So they're giving credit to the earlier use of that label. But by this time, the canning company, Snowflake, is based in Brunswick. So that's kind of cool. And another one, that comes from this brand, which was also Thistle brand, sugar corn. And I mean, look at that, isn't that great? That would make a wonderful poster for a kid's college, you know, wall or something. But speaking of Mr. Maddox, Charles P. Maddox, apparently that's how this design got evolved for a label, because if you look at the very middle of it, it's not advertising Central Maine Power, CMP. It's advertising Charles Porter Maddox, CPM. So that's what that is for. And the Snowflake in later years, that brand becomes synonymous with Baxter products through the 20th century. So this whole notion, though, of factories near farmers' fields for freshness and better products, that's one thing the Baxters pushed early on, and they realized if you're going to really produce a superior product, you've got to make a superior product, and you do that by moving your factories to go close to the cornfield. So they did that, and so in rural places like St. Albans, Maine, you would get a corn factory like this. This is one of their corn factories. And the typical things of a corn factory out in the Maine countryside, turn of the century or early 20th century, would have these sort of three parts to it. The open building on the right would be the husking shed, where corn is brought in bushel baskets, and then a lot of community members from all over the region are hired to piecemeal husk the corn. And then your other buildings, the one with the chimneys is typically where your retorts and cooking devices are, where you're cooking the cans. And then the other building is probably a warehouse where the canned goods are stored before they're shipped out by rail. And there's also, if you look at this picture, there's a ton of cordwood piled up on the far left. And my guess is that's to feed the ovens. When you keep the home fires burning, it takes a lot of fuel. Here the corn's being brought in by a horse-drawn wagon, and you've got a lot of women and other people under the husking shed roof, husking the corn. Here corn's coming into a corn scales, and husking, as I've said, was a very important first step. Here's a husking shed at the Heartland plant, probably about 1920. And then here's another husking party going on at a different factory that wasn't a Baxter product. This was one, I think, from Lovell, Maine, but it's the same idea. This is a Heartland photograph showing how empty these buildings were most of the year. They were built really to handle the peak demand in the fall harvest season, but they were empty most of the rest of the time. Now I threw this little request of marker message in here because in Brunswick, we found out there were sites of 2 early husking sheds used to stand. One of them was right close to where the modern Kate Furbish Elementary School is on the north side of Jordan Avenue. That was an early one. That was also used by Francis Jordan before he sold out to Hartley. And then Rupert remembers the second one on the west side of the railroad tracks on the south side of Jordan Avenue where these buildings are. And the near building is actually Poolin Construction if you ever drive there on Jordan Avenue. So somewhere near these buildings and near the railroad track, and here's an aerial photograph of those buildings in that area. We think sort of maybe where my finger is here. You see my diagram here. It looks like there's a ghosted foundations or something in there. My guess is that the factory was right in there somewhere. But Rupert remembers this one, and he produced some testimony back in January about what happened to that one. And it was after the Baxters stopped using it, it was turned into a kind of a horse stable where riding lessons were offered. And then later on it became a car dealership. But that's a historic spot. That's an early husking factory, Baxter related in Brunswick, where the major offices were of this internationally known family. So that's historically significant, and I think should be marked with a marker. I really literally believe that. And then also, if we're going to mark important sites around Brunswick that are important for these connections, this beautiful building at the corner of Federal Street and the Bath Road, Old Route 1, which back in the day was the Bowdoin President's House, and it was actually built by Francis Jordan, who was a sea captain in the Civil War, and later on Francis Jordan retired to corn canning, and he did develop the initial factory that Baxter used in Brunswick, that Hartley used to allow him to quickly move to Brunswick in the 1880s. If you want to get a sense, so that should be a site too, I think, for Brunswick. That's a historic site. If we ever developed a canning heritage trail, those would be 2 good sites, 3 good sites. If you want to get a sense of what it was like to be at the top of the whole factory operations and to be a major owner of this, Hartley C. Baxter loved yachting, and he was a maritime guy at heart. And between 1904 and 1907, he owned a steam yacht called the Kanawha. And here's a picture of it. Wow. So that thing was 117 feet long at the waterline, and it was first owned by a New York person, a New York owner, and this was taken while the New York guy owned it. But isn't she a beauty? Oh my God, look how graceful and narrow that is. So that's steam propelled. It would have been pretty much, silent and smooth and speedy. And here's another picture of it that the family offered. I'm not sure, Connie, did you come up with this one somewhere?
I don't think so.
Oh, no. Anyway, this came from Living Baxters, and it shows it off the coast of Maine somewhere. And I just include this because we know that it carried a flag like this, the stern. So, Hartley on his steam yachts moving along would have enjoyed that. And in fact, because it was such a thing to see this steam yacht go around, if you read early copies of the Casco Bay Breeze from 1907, they talked about Mrs. Hartley C. Baxter entertaining a large party on board the Kanawha. And they were planning to sail out to the islands, but because of dense fog, they decided not to. And so becoming a canner and owning all these canneries was big business back then. And graphically, to market their many products, we find that a lot of the Baxter labels were basically divided into 3 parts, kind of like a traffic light, red, yellow, and green, but the thirds would typically be Baxter's Finest at the top, then a picture of the product, and then in English, the name of the product at the bottom. So here's one of their sugar pea labels, one of their shelled beans labels. This is all Baxter's Finest, golden sweet corn. So nice colors, good graphics, easy to recognize, easy to read. The repetition of a brand making it more familiar with consumers. So branding, the whole concept starts actually like with cowboys and out in the West and branding livestock because you want to prove the cow is owned by you. You know, so that's what you prove ownership with brands if you're in the livestock or lumber businesses. But for consumer products, the whole notion of a brand is you want to develop customer trust and loyalty and repeat business. So what I love about this one, this is a blow-up of a brand that the Baxters used. It's the HC and Brother logo. But look, it looks very much like it could have been a wrought iron, hot metal brand on the side of a cow as well. It's just very easy to read. And these beautiful, I don't know if these are from the 1920s or what, but they're great graphics, and they're all Baxter's Finest. So yeah, Scott, I think, had these originally on a smaller one. I was able to break it apart and enlarge them. And this is a copy of a similar label that came out of Rupert's collection. I just think the graphics are just top notch. And so anyway, later years, probably around the World War II, they started introducing the notion of including U.S. grade A fancy on it, and the whole notion of the government and having a governmental inspection process going on to guarantee high quality. That developed after the Food and Drug Act was passed. And so then the Baxters start using this U.S. grade A stamp as another guarantee of quality. And they also, because we're all Americans eating these foods and we love our country, they started also using the red, white, and blue of the American flag for the red, white, and blue of the label. So you get these really beautiful, like the corn that Connie held up in the beginning. Very patriotic, very American. What I like about the Baxter story too is that it's tied closely with the whole story of corn, which, as we've said, was Native American in the beginning, and the natives through Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to grow corn, and the Winslow family was actually one of the Mayflower families, descended from the brother of Edward Winslow, develops the first canned corn in Maine, and then the Baxters learn from the Winslows, so they take it over from the Winslows. And so there's a fascinating history behind all of this. And in this little booklet called All for Maine, the story of Governor Percival Baxter, she talked about how the Baxters first got into it by buying a cannery and exporting the canned lobster to Europe. And this all happened right during the Civil War. And after that, they kept building more canneries, and it was a big business. So here's a wonderful picture I found on the internet of Connie hugging James Finney Baxter's marble likeness at the library. And James Finney and Portland Packing owned 13 factories in the late 19th century, and they were the largest packing establishment in the world. They received an award at the Paris Expo in 1867. And then another account here of HC Baxter talks about how they, until 1888, Hartley was with Portland Packing, and then ill health caused him to withdraw, but soon after he moved to Brunswick, and then he starts producing more cases of canned goods, and the business increased and increased, and he brings in his younger brothers as partners, and they start developing factories all over the place. In Maine, these are like the 8 best known locations they had in Maine, but they also had factories in Hampshire, Vermont, in Canada, and as we've said, Iowa. And part of what made this all possible was the railroad, and Brunswick was really well known as a railroad center. So I started wondering, well, how big were these cases, and what did all this volume mean when you say Hartley, canned 11,000 cases in his first year? Well, I did the math on it, and it turns out a case is 24 cans, and these are the dimensions of the cans. And if you laid out those cases end to end, it would be over 2 miles long. So if you could line old Route 1 between where Route 24 hits it at Cook's Corner and 123 hits it by the Federal Street light, and you'd have tin cans cases that whole way. That's 11,000 cases. But this woman here, James Finney Baxter's first wife, Sarah Kimball Lewis Baxter, is the one who's typically overlooked, and there should be much more attention given to her. Her main reason, she had 5 sons. That's a huge accomplishment. And these are the names of the 5 sons: Hartley, Clinton, Eugene, James, and Rupert, in order. And because of that, the nature of that early Baxter family, Hartley had all the future partners he could want to help him develop his business. He's got all these brothers, and they all descend from James Finney, so they all know the business or have had exposure to it since birth, So Hartley, Clinton, Eugene, James, and Rupert are the 5 brothers of first wife Sarah, in order. And if you can't remember that, which it is hard to remember, I have a little mnemonic device here you have to remember. have corn each July, really. HCEJR. So HCEJR is Hartley, Clinton, Eugene, James, and Rupert. So Hartley, with a heart shape, was the eldest, and here he is, a little boy. And here he is with his two younger brothers, would be Clinton and Eugene. And here's Hartley, a little bit older. He's at Bowdoin College now. This is Clinton, his second youngest brother, who also did become a partner of the firm. This is James, a younger brother. We hear quite a bit about him. And this is Rupert. This is one picture of Rupert, and this is a later picture of Rupert after he gets glasses. So that is Rupert White's grandfather right there. And I'm told by Rupert that this Rupert was involved a lot in the financial management of the business. But they were all involved. Hartley was the first to go to Bowdoin, and he was a member of the class of 1878. These are the 1878 memorial gates at Bowdoin, right up near the First Congregational Church. Here's a picture of his fraternity, senior year. He was a member of the Deke House, Delta Kappa Epsilon. And you can see he's in this group shot. He's at the front row on the left. That's Hartley. And other frat friends of his include the fellow on the upper right is named Alfred Burton. Well, Alfred Burton ends up becoming a dean of MIT, and his son, Felix Burton, becomes an architect in the 20s, and it's that son that designs the first National Bank of Brunswick. So this connection between the Baxters and the Burtons, and I mean, it's all interrelated. Here's Hartley again. And now Hartley married Mary Lincoln, who was a daughter of Dr. John Lincoln in Brunswick. And the Lincoln connection is also typically overlooked, but it's very important for the firm's success in Brunswick because the Lincolns have deep, deep, deep Brunswick roots. They go back to the Dunlaps and the earliest settlement of Brunswick. This is a picture of Hartley and his wife Mary and their eldest boy, their only son, John. And this is Mary at a later date, and she's quite a beautiful woman. And she also has, if you look at this picture now, you may recognize this from the United States penny that's in your pocket. President Abraham Lincoln was a cousin of these Lincolns. They are all related. And so if you ever did a DNA test, you would probably find that you are related to the ancestor of Abraham Lincoln. And they came, from Rhode Island, I believe it was. But anyway, this marker business is important because all of Lincoln Street in Brunswick, which is a beautiful part of Brunswick, is that Lincoln family developed that. And it's an important part of Brunswick. So the four kids that Hartley and Mary had were in order: Sarah, Ellen, John, and Emily. They had 3 daughters and 1 son. John ends up sort of assuming management of the company, but you see in these pictures, here's Hartley holding John, and one of his sisters is over to the far left. And then Rupert told me that, so you've got Mary in the middle, and then at the far right, you've actually got Hartley's brother Rupert Baxter and his daughter who's Mary, who became Mary White on the right. So and here's John Lincoln Baxter, the son of Hartley. So John Lincoln Baxter does assume control. Here he is also in the foreground of this great shot of him with his 3 sisters. Wonderful picture. And the best landmark in Brunswick that we know associated with this family specifically is the amazing Colonial Revival mansion that's at 10 College Street. The Colonial Revival was America's most popular architectural style between 1876 and 1940, and this is one of the chief monuments in Brunswick of buildings built in that style. This is the Baxter House, or the Hartley and Mary Baxter House at 10 College Street. It's now known as Baxter House, and it's used to house Bowdoin students. You see the scale of it is immense. The dormer windows are impressive, so is the hip roof. But the best thing of all is that there's the colossal columns on it and this monumental semicircular portico, which is incredible. And we're told that a lot of the detailing for this, the scale of it, was modeled after this nearby Deke House, which had the same architects, Chapman and Fraser of Boston, did both of these buildings in quick succession. But the Baxter House you may also recognize because there's the Baxter House, and have you ever seen this building anywhere in your life? This is the White House, and I'm convinced that the White House is what sort of inspired Chapman and Fraser to do that monumental semicircular portico on the front of the Baxter House with these colossal 2-story columns, just incredible. You look at it, it's like the scale is just, it's more handsome and it's colossal, and it's more impressive than almost any other building in Brunswick. So here we go with Hartley and John Lincoln Baxter and John Lincoln's son Jack Baxter coming out of the Baxter House. Here's a close-up of that. A great picture, 3 generations. This is showing on the left, we've got, we have Mary and one of her brothers, who was Isaac Lincoln. And here's a whole paragraph about Isaac Lincoln. He went out to Aberdeen, South Dakota, I believe it was, and made a lot of money in banking and other industries. And he was written up. And it said in the write-up, his sister Mary, now Mrs. Hartley C. Baxter, lives in Brunswick. The sister's husband is the son of James Finney Baxter of Portland, one of the most noted men of Maine. Here's Mary and a daughter. Is this Constance, the daughter, I believe? What is her sister? I forget. One of the daughters. Maybe it was Sarah. I'm sorry. It's been a while since I did this. But that's Mary in the rocking chair, and one of her daughters behind. And then here we have John Lincoln Baxter, second from the left, with his mother Mary in the middle, and again the 3 sisters of John. Here's Hartley. And what's interesting about we didn't get this far in the Brunswick presentation because we only had 45 minutes and the machine sort of the time was up. But I wanted to show this is other monumental buildings in Brunswick that were associated with the Baxters included the earlier building that stood where this brick building stands now on Cumberland Street and Union Street. There used to be a big mansarded building back there that looked like this, and it was called the Brunswick Hotel. I'm sorry, Hospital. It was the Brunswick Hospital, and before that it was built initially for a Captain O'Brien, and then it was sold to a Schofield, and then later on in the 1880s the Baxters had it, and we were told by one of the Wheelers, Brunswick historians, that Hartley and his wife lived in this house when their company was started in Brunswick. So that's pretty cool, and that puts that site on the map. We also know from Wheeler's history that shortly thereafter they came to occupy other buildings on Main Street, including the Old Town Hall that was built in 1884, shown here. And then on the left, we've got the site of where the bracket block will be built that became the Gulf of Maine bookstore. You see what's going on here? So we're looking.
Back up.
Okay.
Back up one, and there's Gulf of Maine is right on the left, our left.
Well, not quite. This is actually, the Gulf of Maine hasn't been built yet because the Gulf of Maine is in the bracket block. That's a little building that was sandwiched onto this other with the Lufkin block. So this shows before 1888 when the bracket block was built, but it just shows the town hall. What's neat about it is this town hall was so impressive after it was built. It became such a stunning success. It was not only a town hall, but it was the library, it was the post office, it had a theater in there. And so people wanted to build other, commercial frontages near it. So this other little building that became the bracket block right in front of that trolley, those trolleys, or the Gulf of Maine bookstore did get built. But this is Old Town Hall, a little sketch of that. And you can see the Baxters had an office on the upper floor of that as well. There's a picture I drew of the bracket block. We think that's the oldest surviving Baxter and Brother canning offices in the entire state. They probably had their offices at the second floor level, and we did find out from some of the earlier research we did in the 80s that this was a Samuel B. Dunning designed building, and these are Samuel B. Dunning's original blueprints that we found in Freeport in the 1980s. And you can see this is the elevation that faced the town hall. And you look at the floor plan now for these things, but I got it here, I'm sorry. Thought I had a floor plan. Took it up. Anyway, these are curved bow windows, which give you wonderful panoramic views. And so they were up there. That was for Baxter. And here it is as the Gulf of Maine. But they were in that building upstairs early on. So this is a very important part of Brunswick, again, for the development of the Baxter Company. And this picture, which shows the east side of Main Street in Brunswick, a little bit north of where now is the Tondro block. This was the old Dennison Box Company building that got taken over by the Baxters. So they had a major presence here as well. And this, finally, last but not least, will go to the First National Bank building and the corncob capitals that are so famous. This is a picture of similar corncob capitals at the U.S. Capitol in Washington. So the corncob capitals were invented by the American architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who was Jefferson's architect. And he brought it about because he knew that the corn was an American plant. So a capital designed after corn was a uniquely American architectural expression. And so he was wanting this as an American architecture. And clearly when Felix Burton and the Baxters reused it, the bank building, that's what they had in mind. They were showing off the American heritage and the corn canning. It's kind of a cool thing. So I think, and this is what I'm pushing for, there needs to be walking tours in Brunswick of a lot of these sites. Would be kind of fun to do. And maybe there should be a Baxter Center of Brunswick, you know, where you could show more of the labels and discuss things. We found, this is one of that Puritan name we talked about earlier, that label brand was used even in the 1940s to produce products like canned popcorn. When's the last time you guys had canned popcorn? I can't think I've ever had canned popcorn.
Oh, yeah.
But that was a Baxter product. So that's that. That's the end of the show that we showed for the Baxters. Thank you very much.